class. So in today's class we are going to learn something about carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are the most abundant biomolecules, and they are the hydrates of carbon. So hydrates means it is another name of water. So they contain hydrogen, carbon and oxygen. So carbohydrates are the hydrates of carbon and they possess carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. And if you see the general formula for carbohydrates, the general formula is CH2ON, but still we have certain other compounds which obey this formula. So they are acetic acid, that is CH3COOH, and lactic acid, that is CH3COOH. So if you see the case of acetic acid, CH3COOH, so we just count down 1, 2 carbon, so it is C2, hydrogens 3, 4, C4, oxygens it is 1, 2. So C2H4O2, N is 2, so C2H4O2. So acetic acid, it obeys the general formula of carbohydrates. And coming to lactic acid which contains C1, 2, 3, C3, hydrogens 3, 4, 5, H5, and oxygens 1, 2, sorry it's not 3, 4, 5, 6, so it is H6, oxygens 1, 2, 3. So it is C3H6O3. So now N is equal to 3. So it is C3H6 and O3. So these two compounds, even though they are not the carbohydrates, they obey the general formula of carbohydrates. And there are certain carbohydrates, actual carbohydrates, which do not obey the general formula of carbohydrates. So first let us write down the general formula of carbohydrates. So this is the general formula of carbohydrates. So they are rhamnose, that is C6H12O5, and dehydroxyribose, that is C5H10O4. So for example, here we can say N is 6, so C6H12, but here O is not 6, it is only 5. So this compound rhamnose, it is not obeying the formula. Coming to dehydroxyribose, it is C5, so N is equal to 5, C5H10, but O4, not O5. So these two are the actual carbohydrate molecules, but they do not obey or they do not satisfy the general formula CH2ON. So we simply cannot define carbohydrates as hydrates of carbon. So let's see the definition, actual definition of carbohydrates. So we can define the carbohydrates as polyhydroxy. Poly means they contain many hydroxyl groups. So polyhydroxy aldehydes, they possess aldehyde as a functional group or ketone as a functional group. So carbohydrates, they contain either aldehyde as a functional group or the ketone as a functional group, and they also possess hydroxyl molecules, hydroxyl groups in their compounds. Or the compounds which produce these compounds on hydrolysis are also called carbohydrates. So simply we can define carbohydrates as polyhydroxyaldehydes or ketones, or the compounds which produce them on hydrolysis. So let's discuss about the functions of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, they serve as the most abundant dietary source of energy. So it's very simple. We all are consuming the carbohydrates for gaining the energy. Of course, we all know that proteins are important, fats are important. Even though they are very important for the health, along with them, even the carbohydrates are very important to use the energy, to gain the energy, and also to use the energy immediately. We depend mainly on carbohydrates, and these carbohydrates are the most abundant dietary sources of energy for any organism. And carbohydrates, they also act as the precursors of certain organic compounds like fats and amino acids. So carbohydrates, they act as the precursors. Precursors means the initial compounds, from them the modified compounds will be produced. So carbohydrates act as the precursor molecules for producing the organic compounds like fats and amino acids. And the carbohydrates as glycoproteins and glycolipids. We can also call them as glycoconjugates. So when we say glycoproteins and glycolipids, glyco means it is the sugar molecule, carbohydrate, and protein. So here sugar molecules, they bind with protein molecules and they are forming a hybrid compound, that is the glycoprotein. And here also the sugar molecule, that is binding with lipid molecule, and it is forming a hybrid molecule or the conjugate called glycolipid. So simply we call these two as glycoconjugates. So in the form of glycoconjugates, carbohydrates act as the signals that determine the intracellular location or metabolic fate of glycoconjugates. In the form of glycoconjugates, carbohydrates, they act as the signal molecules, they act as the signals that determine the intracellular location or metabolic fate of glycoconjugates. So this we understand once we discuss about the transport of molecules. So after their production, their synthesis, they have to reach their destiny. So for them to reach their destiny, they need certain signal molecules to find out their path. So carbohydrates in the form of these glycoconjugates, they act as the signal molecules to determine their intracellular location, where they have to be located, or simply we can say their metabolic fate of those glycoconjugate molecules. And skeletal joints, they need the lubrication. So in the form of glycoproteins, carbohydrates, they lubricate the skeletal joints, and they also participate in adhesion and recognition. So adhesion means it is to bind with the neighboring cells or with the different compounds. The glycoproteins or carbohydrates are very much needed, and they also participate in recognition, as we have discussed in the previous point. So carbohydrates, they act as the structural elements and also the protective elements in the cell walls of bacteria and plants. So we all know in plants, cellulose is the most important structural component, and also the cellulose is the most abundant compound in the biosphere. So in the form of cellulose in the plant cell walls, the carbohydrates play a very important role. Along with that, even in the connective tissues of animals also, we can see the carbohydrates as the main structural components. And they also serve as the storage forms of energy. Carbohydrates also serve as the storage forms of energy. This is in the form of, for example, glycogen for the immediate energy requirements of the body. So when the body needs the energy immediately, then the glycogen, which is nothing but the storage form of energy in the body, that will be used up to gain or to give the energy. So these are the different functional properties or the roles of the carbohydrates. Coming to the classification of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, the word saccharide, which means sugar. So the word saccharide is derived from a Greek word, that is saccharin. So from the Greek word saccharin, the saccharide is derived, and which means sugar. So here the carbohydrates can be classified into, so based on the number of saccharide units that they possess, carbohydrates can be differentiated into monosaccharides, oligosaccharides and polysaccharides. Here mono means they contain single sugar unit. Oligo means it is few sugar units. So we can confine this number to 2 to 10. And the poly means it is many. Or we can say polymer of monosaccharides. So monosaccharides contain single carbohydrate or saccharide molecule. Oligosaccharides contain few oligosaccharides contain few monosaccharide units. It's around 2 to 10 monosaccharide units. And polysaccharides, they contain many, even millions of monosaccharide units, or simply we can say polymers of monosaccharides. So monosaccharides, as we have discussed, mono means single, saccharide means carbohydrate or sugar molecule. So here they possess single sugar unit, or we can say single polyhydroxy aldehyde or ketone unit. And these are the simplest carbohydrates. So they cannot be hydrolyzed further. So since they are simplest molecules, they cannot be hydrolyzed or they cannot be broken down into different units. So they are the simplest monosaccharides, simplest carbohydrates. And they possess the general formula CnH2ON. So even the monosaccharides, based on the functional group they possess, they can be differentiated into aldoses and ketoses. So here aldoses, they contain aldehyde as the functional group. Aldehyde as the functional group, and ketoses possess ketone as the functional group. So examples for these: the reference carbohydrate, that is glyceroldehyde, glucose, mannose, galactose, all these are aldoses. And coming to, you see the structure, and then CHO, OH, H, CH2, OH. So here you can see aldehyde as the functional group. And the example for ketoses is dihydroxyacetone. Dihydroxyacetone. If you see the structure of dihydroxyacetone, so here which contains ketone as the functional group. So we have another classification of monosaccharides based on the number of carbon atoms. So they are, so if the sugar unit contains 3 carbon atoms in it, it is triose. If it contains 4 carbons, tetrose, 5 carbons, pentose, 6 carbons, hexose, and 7 carbons, heptose. So this is another kind of classification of monosaccharides. So while we are giving the name of the carbohydrates, we have to use these two. For example, you can see glucose. Glucose is also called aldohexose. Aldohexose, because glucose contains aldehyde as a functional group and which contains 6 carbon atoms. So while giving the name of the name of the compound, we are using both of these two. One is the functional group and another one is the number of carbon atoms. And another one, there is a fructose. Fructose is a ketohexose. So here fructose, it has ketone as a functional group and hexose is 6 carbon compound. Glucose is the most abundant monosaccharide. The oligosaccharides, as we have already discussed, the oligo means it is few. So here the number which is confined to 2 to 10 carbons. 2 to 10 units, monosaccharide units. So if the compound contains 2 to 10 monosaccharide units, those are called oligosaccharides. So here, based on the number of sugar units that they contain, they are differentiated into disaccharides, trisaccharides, tetrasaccharides, etc. So depending on the number of sugar units they possess, they are called differentiated into disaccharides, trisaccharides, tetrasaccharides, and so on. So among the oligosaccharides, disaccharides are the most abundant. And even we can say the typical disaccharide, that is the sucrose. Sucrose, which is the cane sugar, which contains 2 units of sugars. They are D-glucose and D-fructose. And these two are joined with a glycosidic bond, that is alpha 1 beta 2 linkage. So the main important point for oligosaccharides is the bonding, the kind of bonding. So here we are saying oligosaccharides contain 2 to 10 sugars, 2 to 10 monosaccharide units. So how these monosaccharide units are joined with one another means it is by the glycosidic linkage. So in case of sucrose, we have 2 monosaccharide units. They are D-glucose and D-fructose. These two are joined with one another by a glycosidic linkage called alpha 1 and beta 2 linkage. So these we will understand once we discuss in detail about the oligosaccharides. In cells, mostly the oligosaccharides, they do not exist as free entities. So the oligosaccharides which contain more than 3 units, they exist as glycoconjugates. So we have already discussed about glycoconjugates. So glycoconjugates are nothing but the glycoproteins or glycolipids. So in the form of glycoconjugates, the oligosaccharides which contain more than 3 units, they exist in the form of glycoconjugates. Then polysaccharides. Poly means it is nothing but many saccharides. So here the number is many, more than 10 units. If they contain more than 10 units of monosaccharides, and then those are nothing but the polysaccharides. Even here the number, it may be even to millions of monosaccharide units joined with one another by glycosidic linkages, and they form polysaccharides. So simply we can define them as polymers of monosaccharides. So we take example of cellulose. Cellulose, which contains the recurring units of D-glucose, but here it is the linear chain. And in case of glycogen, glycogen also contains the recurring units of D-glucose, but here it is in the form of a branch chain. So both the compounds, cellulose and glycogen, they contain the same kind of molecules. The recurring units of D-glucose means the same D-glucose molecule will be repeated for many times. But in the case of cellulose, they will be arranged in the form of a branched chain like this. They will be arranged in the form of a linear fashion like this. But in case of glycogen, even though it contains the recurring units of D-glucose, here we can see the branched chain. So what makes the difference between these two? It is the type of glycosidic linkage. In glycogen, we can see the arrangement in a branched fashion, and in cellulose it is a linear fashion. But the main difference between these two is type of glycosidic linkages. So because of this difference, both of them, even though they have the same units, because of this difference, they both have different properties and different biological roles. Okay, and even the polysaccharides, coming to the classification of polysaccharides, simply we can differentiate them into homopolysaccharides and heteropolysaccharides. So homopolysaccharides, homo means similar. So here the monosaccharide units are of similar type, and heteropolysaccharides, they contain different types of monosaccharide units. This is all about the introduction of carbohydrates, that is the definition, functions and the basic classification of carbohydrates. From the next class, we are going to discuss in detail about the monosaccharides, oligo and polysaccharides. Hope you all understood. Thank you so much.